Tonight you discover why you feel tired even after sleeping 8 hours. The exhaustion isn't physical. Your body rests, but your mind never stops working. It defends your image, compares you to others, protects opinions you didn't choose, maintains a version of you that requires constant effort to keep intact. This work never ends because the self you're defending doesn't actually exist as something solid and permanent. You're protecting empty space, building walls around air. In the next 3 hours, you will see exactly what creates this exhaustion and exactly how it ends. You will meet people who discovered that admitting "I don't know" brings more peace than defending an image of wisdom. People who spent years suffering from comparison until they saw the illusion that worth exists on a scale. People who defended borrowed beliefs until one conversation revealed they'd been protecting ideas that weren't even theirs. Before this journey begins, settle completely into rest. From Tokyo to Toronto, people are lying down just like you, receiving these teachings that have freed countless minds from unnecessary suffering. Adjust your pillows. Pull your blankets to exactly the warmth your body wants. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You don't need to concentrate hard or get this right. Just be here, comfortable, ready to receive something that will change how you experience your own mind. The Buddha taught that suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from clinging to a false sense of self. Tonight, you see through that illusion. Every morning you wake up and put on a costume. Not clothing, though that's part of it, but an entire performance of who you need to be today. At work, you'll perform competence, hiding any confusion or uncertainty behind confident nods and careful phrases. With friends, you'll perform ease, making sure your struggles don't show too much, your neediness stays hidden, your vulnerabilities remain carefully managed. Online, you'll curate authenticity, selecting which honest moments to share, which flaws make you relatable without making you lesser, which struggles prove you're real without proving you're failing. This performance requires constant vigilance. Did I say the right thing in that meeting? Did they notice when I didn't understand? Am I coming across as too eager, too aloof, too confident, too uncertain? The questions never stop because the image you're maintaining is fragile, constructed, requiring constant adjustment to keep intact. You might think this is just normal social awareness, being appropriate in different contexts. But notice what happens in your body when someone questions your competence. The immediate tightness in your chest, the rush of defensive words forming before you've even heard their full sentence, the way your mind races through justifications, explanations, evidence that you're not what they're suggesting you might be. That reaction isn't about the actual criticism. It's about protecting an image you've spent years constructing, this capable, together, worthy version of yourself that you present to the world and, more exhaustingly, to yourself. The Buddha watched this pattern in everyone he met. Kings and beggars, scholars and farmers, monks and merchants, all imprisoned by the same mechanism, all working tirelessly to maintain an image of who they thought they needed to be, defending that image against any threat, real or imagined. He saw that this imprisonment created specific, predictable suffering. When reality contradicted the image, people experienced intense distress, not because reality was actually threatening, but because it threatened the story they were telling about themselves. When others didn't validate the image, people felt diminished, not because they actually became less, but because the reflection they were seeking didn't appear in the mirror others held up. And he saw something most people miss entirely. The image you're defending isn't even real. It's a construction, a story, a collection of ideas about who you are that you've mistaken for your actual self. This becomes clear when you meet someone who stops defending their image and discovers what happens next. In a small village outside the ancient city of Makikasanda, there lived a householder named Chita, who had become famous throughout the region for his understanding of the Buddha's teachings. He had never ordained as a monk, never renounced his family or business, never gone to live in a forest monastery. He remained an ordinary person with ordinary responsibilities, managing his household, conducting his trade, raising his children. But when Chitta spoke about the nature of mind, about suffering and its end, about the path to freedom, even experienced monastics would stop to listen. His words carried a clarity that didn't come from memorizing texts or mastering philosophy, but from direct seeing, from actually investigating his own experience with the precision of a skilled craftsman, examining his tools. People traveled for days to ask him questions. Monks would visit his home and sit at his feet, like students before a master. His reputation spread across the countryside. Chitta, the householder, whose wisdom rivals that of the greatest teachers. One afternoon, a wandering philosopher arrived in the village. This man had spent 40 years studying with various masters, had memorized vast collections of teachings, could recite complex philosophical arguments from memory, and had built an identity entirely around being recognized as wise. His name was Nigantha Nataputta, though most people simply called him the Wanderer. He dressed in distinctive robes that marked his philosophical school, carried himself with the bearing of someone who expected deference, and spoke in the technical language of the educated elite. When he heard villagers praising Chitta's wisdom, something tightened in his chest. How could a mere householder, someone who hadn't even renounced worldly life, who still slept with his wife and concerned himself with profit and loss, be called wise? This challenged everything the wanderer had built his identity upon. For 40 years, he had sacrificed comfort, wandered homeless, studied complex texts, mastered philosophical debate, all to establish himself as a person of profound knowledge. And here was an ordinary merchant, living an ordinary life, receiving the recognition that the wanderer believed belonged to people like himself. dedicated seekers who had given up everything for wisdom. The threat wasn't to the wanderer's actual well-being. Citta's reputation didn't harm him in any concrete way, but it threatened the image he had spent decades constructing: the wise renunciant, the serious seeker, the person whose knowledge set him apart from and above ordinary householders. So he went to test Citta, to expose him as a fraud, to restore the natural order where true wisdom belonged to those who had properly renounced worldly life. He found Citta sitting under a tree near his home, speaking with a small group of villagers about mindfulness in daily work. Citta was describing how to bring full attention to washing dishes, how awareness of the water's temperature and the feel of the cloth could become a meditation as profound as any formal practice. The wanderer waited until Citta finished, then stepped forward. "Householder," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal challenge, "I have a question about the nature of consciousness and its various manifestations." He proceeded to ask an extraordinarily complex question, loaded with technical terminology, referencing obscure philosophical distinctions, designed to confuse anyone without extensive formal training. The question itself was a performance, a demonstration of the wanderer's erudition, a test that would reveal Citta as an unsophisticated amateur, stumbling through concepts he didn't truly understand. The villagers looked at Citta, waiting for his response. Some looked worried, as if the wanderer's impressive display might diminish their beloved teacher. Citta listened carefully to the entire question. When the wanderer finished, Citta smiled. Not a defensive smile, not a competitive smile, but the gentle smile of someone who had just heard something genuinely interesting. "That's a wonderful question," Citta said. "I don't fully understand it myself." The villagers looked disappointed. The wanderer's chest swelled with satisfaction. Finally, this householder was being revealed as the pretender he truly was. The natural order was being restored, the truly wise recognized, the fraud exposed. But Citta continued, unhurried and untroubled. "However, let me share what I do understand from my own direct experience." What followed wasn't a philosophical argument or an attempt to match the wanderer's technical expertise. Citta simply described what he had observed in his own mind during years of patient, honest investigation. He spoke about noticing how seeing happens, how it requires eyes and visible forms meeting in a particular way, how consciousness arises at that meeting, how none of these elements exists separately as a permanent thing. He described watching this process thousands of times while looking at his merchandise in the market, at his children's faces, at the lamp flame in the evening. He talked about hearing, how sound reaches the ear, how consciousness arises at that contact, how the whole experience is empty of any permanent, independent experiencer. He had noticed this while listening to his wife speak, to merchants arguing over prices, to rain on the roof at night. Everything Citta described came from direct observation, not from books or teachers or philosophical systems. He spoke in simple language about ordinary experiences that anyone could verify in their own lives. No technical jargon, no showing off, no attempt to prove he knew more than the wanderer. The wanderer tried to interrupt several times with more complex questions, more technical challenges, more opportunities to demonstrate his superior education. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The villagers were leaning forward, not because Sitta was performing expertise, but because he was describing their own experience back to them in ways that made everything clearer. The wanderer's impressive terminology had created distance and confusion. Chitta's simple observations were creating recognition and understanding. Finally, the wanderer's defenses cracked enough for a real question to emerge. Not a test, but actual confusion that had troubled him for years, despite all his study. But if there's no permanent self doing the experiencing, then who is it that becomes free from suffering? Chitta looked at him with genuine warmth. "Friend, I notice you're working very hard right now. May I ask, who are you trying to prove something to? Me or yourself?" The question landed like a physical blow. The wanderer's mouth opened, but no words came out. His carefully constructed arguments dissolved. His defensive posture collapsed. In that moment, he saw with complete clarity what he'd been doing for 40 years. Every teacher he'd studied with, every text he'd memorized, every philosophical debate he'd won, all of it had been in service of constructing and defending an image of himself as wise, knowledgeable, superior to ordinary people like this householder. He had spent 4 decades accumulating knowledge, but the accumulation itself had become a wall between him and actual understanding. He was so busy defending his expertise that he couldn't actually learn anything new. His cup was so full of what he already knew that nothing fresh could enter. And the most painful recognition, he didn't even know if he truly understood the things he could recite so perfectly. He had memorized answers but had never honestly investigated the questions. He could quote texts about the nature of self, but had never actually looked at his own mind with the patient attention Sitta described. All his knowledge was in service of an image, the wise wanderer, the serious seeker, the person who deserved recognition and respect. And maintaining that image had become more important than the wisdom the image was supposed to represent. The tightness in his chest that had driven him to challenge Chitta wasn't about truth or understanding. It was about defending a constructed self against a perceived threat. And the defending itself was creating all his suffering. He sat down heavily on the ground, no longer caring how he appeared. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't actually know anything." It wasn't defeat. It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. And in that honesty, something that had been locked tight for decades began to open. Chitta sat down beside him. "Now," he said gently, "you're ready to learn." Over the following days, the wanderer stayed in the village. He stopped performing expertise and started actually investigating his experience the way Chitta described, with patient attention, honest observation, willingness to say, "I don't know," when he didn't know. Villagers were startled to see this man who had arrived in impressive robes, speaking in complex philosophical language, now sitting quietly, asking simple questions, admitting confusion without shame. The transformation wasn't that he gained new knowledge, it was that he stopped needing to defend an image of already having it. And in that stopping, actual understanding became possible for the first time. Perhaps you recognize this pattern in yourself, not in the dramatic form of challenging teachers and defending philosophical positions, but in quieter, daily ways. At work, someone asks a question you don't know the answer to, and instead of simply saying, "I don't know," you feel your body tighten. You fumble for an answer, any answer, because admitting ignorance feels like admitting inadequacy. The image of competent professional that you've carefully constructed feels threatened by 3 simple words: "I don't know." Or in conversations with friends, someone shares knowledge about a topic you're supposed to understand: politics, parenting, health, and you nod along, even though you're confused, because asking for clarification might reveal that you're not as informed as you appear to be. Or online, you post your opinions with certainty, even when you're uncertain, because the image you're projecting is of someone who has it figured out, who knows what they're talking about, who is worth listening to. All of this defending creates a specific kind of exhaustion. It's not the tiredness that comes from hard work or physical effort. It's the depletion that comes from constant performance, constant vigilance, constant management of how you appear. The wanderer spent 40 years in this exhaustion before one question from Citta revealed what he was actually doing. You don't need 40 years. You can see it right now. Notice what happens when someone questions your competence at something you pride yourself on. The immediate defensiveness, the rush to explain, justify, prove. That reaction isn't about the actual criticism, it's about protecting the image. Notice what happens when you don't know something you feel you should know. The shame, the scrambling for an answer, the discomfort of being exposed as less knowledgeable than your image suggests. Notice what happens when you make a mistake publicly. How much energy goes into damage control, not fixing the actual mistake, but managing how others perceive you in light of the mistake. All of this is defending an image, and the image isn't even real. It's a construction, a story you've been telling about yourself for so long that you've mistaken it for who you actually are. What the wanderer discovered, what Citta had discovered years before, is that the image doesn't need defending because it isn't you. You are the awareness that notices thoughts, feelings, sensations, arising and passing. The image is just one more thing arising in that awareness. A story, a collection of ideas, no more solid or permanent than a cloud. When you see this clearly, something extraordinary happens. The defending can stop, not because you've defeated some part of yourself or achieved perfect confidence, but because you've seen through the illusion that there's anything permanent requiring defense. Someone questions your knowledge, and you can simply say, "You're right, I don't know that." No collapse, no shame, just fact. Someone criticizes your work, and you can hear whether the criticism is useful without your entire worth feeling threatened. Someone succeeds where you've failed, and you can appreciate their success without yours diminishing. This isn't about building better self-esteem or developing thicker skin. It's about seeing that the self whose esteem you're trying to build is a process, not a thing. An image, not an entity. And images don't need the desperate protection you've been giving them. The wanderer's entire life changed in the moment he stopped defending. Not because he suddenly became wise, he still had much to learn, but because he was finally free to actually learn, instead of performing knowledge he didn't possess. Your life changes in the same moment. The moment you stop defending an image of competence and simply show up as you actually are, sometimes knowledgeable, sometimes confused, always learning. The moment you stop curating an image of success and simply engage with what's in front of you. The moment you stop protecting an image of being okay and honestly acknowledge when you're struggling. This doesn't mean broadcasting every vulnerability or abandoning all social awareness. It means recognizing that the constant work of image maintenance is optional, unnecessary, a habit you can choose to drop. Right now, as you lie here, notice if you're worried about being a good listener, about getting something valuable from these teachings, about whether you're relaxing correctly or meditating properly, or doing this right. That's the image-maintaining mechanism still running. Even here, even now, trying to make sure you appear to yourself, to some imagined observer, as someone who is doing this spiritual practice correctly. And now, gently, like setting down something heavy you've been carrying for miles, let that concern drop away. You don't need to be a good anything right now. You don't need to get this right. You don't need to prove your worth through perfect receptivity to these teachings. The wanderer found peace not by becoming better at defending his image, but by seeing that he'd been defending empty space all along. The self he'd spent 40 years protecting wasn't actually there as a permanent solid thing requiring protection. And neither is yours. This doesn't mean you don't exist. You're clearly here, breathing, experiencing. But what you think of as yourself, this constructed image you defend so carefully, is a story, not a fact. And stories don't require the exhausting protection you've been giving them. When you see this clearly, when you really see it the way Chitta saw it and helped the wanderer see it, the prison door opens. Not because you've escaped to somewhere else, but because you realize the prison was made of thoughts you were taking as solid walls. The freedom isn't in some future achievement. It's available right now, in the simple recognition that you don't need to defend what you've been defending. Let that sink in as you rest. Feel what it's like to simply be, without maintaining any image, without defending any position, without proving anything to anyone. This is where real peace begins. The second prison is built from a simple question you ask hundreds of times each day. How do I measure up? Not against your own values or genuine aspirations, but against everyone else's achievements, appearances, relationships, success. You wake up, and before your feet touch the floor, your mind is already calculating. Your colleague got promoted. Are you falling behind? Your friend posted vacation photos. Why isn't your life that beautiful? Someone younger achieved something you haven't. What does that say about you? This measuring never stops because there's always someone doing better in some area. Always someone richer, more attractive, more successful, more spiritually advanced, more everything, and always someone doing worse, which provides temporary relief until you remember that downward comparison just proves you need comparison to feel okay. The Buddha saw this pattern clearly in every village he visited, every monastery he taught in, every conversation he had. Human beings trapped in an endless cycle of measuring themselves against each other, finding either inadequacy or superiority, neither of which brought actual peace. He taught in the Dhammapada, look at others' faults, and you remain in bondage. Look at your own and you find freedom. Not because examining your flaws is virtuous self-punishment, but because when your attention is consumed by comparison, it's not available for the actual work of understanding your own mind. What's remarkable is how invisible this bondage feels. Comparison seems like natural awareness, helpful information, reasonable assessment of where you stand. It doesn't feel like a cage until you meet someone who discovered what happens when you stop comparing entirely. In a monastery outside the ancient city of Savatthi, 2 young men joined the monastic community on the same day. They were given their robes in the same ceremony, assigned to the same teacher, began their training side by side as equals. The first was named Lakuntaka. He was short with an unremarkable face, a quiet manner that made people's eyes slide past him in groups, a voice that didn't carry well in large gatherings. When he spoke, people often talked over him without meaning to, simply because his presence didn't command attention. The second was named Badiya. He stood tall, with a kind of natural grace that made robes look elegant instead of simply functional. When he spoke, people leaned forward to listen. His voice carried warmth and clarity, making complex teachings sound accessible and profound. For the first few months, this difference didn't matter much. Both were beginners, both were learning the basic practices, both were equally awkward at meditation and equally confused by the subtler teachings. They were friends, supporting each other through the challenges of leaving household life behind. But as time passed, the monastery's response to them began to diverge in ways neither had anticipated. When Badiya recited teachings during group sessions, the senior monks nodded approvingly. When Lakuntaka recited the same teachings with the same accuracy, the room felt polite, but unengaged. Visiting laypeople began requesting Badiya specifically when they wanted Dharma talks. Lakuntaka was assigned to cleaning duties and meal preparation. After a year, Badiya was invited to teach a group of new monks. Lakuntaka was asked to organize the meditation hall's cushions. After 2 years, Badiya received special robes offered by a wealthy patron. Lakuntaka received nothing. The comparison began quietly in Lakuntaka's mind, barely noticeable at first. Just a small observation. Badiya gets asked to teach while I sweep floors. Nothing dramatic, just a fact. But facts repeated become stories, and stories repeated become identity. Within 3 years, Lakuntaka's entire practice had become poisoned by comparison. Every morning meditation was interrupted by thoughts of Badiya sitting in the front row while he sat in back. Every teaching became a chance to measure whether he understood as quickly, as deeply, as correctly as Badiya seemed to. Every day dissolved into dozens of small measurements. Badiya was asked to give Dharma talk. I wasn't. Badiya was praised for his insight. I was ignored. Badiya was chosen to attend the elders' private teaching. I was cleaning the meditation hall. The measuring created a specific kind of suffering. When Badiya received recognition, Lakuntaka felt diminished, as if there was a fixed amount of worth in the monastery, and Badiya receiving more meant he was receiving less. When Badiya was praised, Lakuntaka heard it as implicit criticism of himself. When Badiya was asked to represent the monastery at regional gatherings, Lakuntaka experienced it as personal rejection. None of this was Badiya's fault. Badiya wasn't competing, wasn't trying to outshine anyone, wasn't even aware that his natural gifts were creating suffering in his friend. He was simply being himself, which happened to be the kind of self that communities naturally elevated and celebrated. But Lakuntaka couldn't see that. His attention was so consumed by comparison that he couldn't see Badiya as a separate person with his own path. He could only see him as the standard against which Lakuntaka was constantly being measured and constantly falling short. 5 years into their training, Lakuntaka's meditation practice had effectively stopped. He would sit on the cushion, but instead of investigating his mind, he was replaying every instance where Badiya received recognition while he was overlooked. Instead of examining the nature of suffering, he was constructing elaborate arguments for why his insights were actually deeper than Badiya's, but went unrecognized. Instead of cultivating compassion, he was nursing resentment. He knew this was wrong. The teachings were clear about the danger of comparison, about the poison of envy, about the importance of rejoicing in others' good fortune. He tried to force himself to feel happy when Badiya succeeded. He tried to suppress the bitter thoughts when they arose. He tried to convince himself that he didn't care about recognition. But trying to not compare is still comparison. Just comparison, with an added layer of shame about doing it. The measuring continued, now with the additional suffering of feeling like a failed practitioner for not being able to stop measuring. An elderly nun named Uttara came to visit the monastery. She had been practicing for 40 years, had trained under several of the Buddha's direct disciples, and had a reputation for seeing through people's self-deceptions with startling clarity. She spent several days at the monastery, speaking with monks individually. When she sat with Buddha, she asked him about his practice and nodded appreciatively at his clear understanding. When she sat with Lakuntaka, she looked at him in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You're carrying something heavy," she said quietly. Lakuntaka's defenses rose immediately. "I practice diligently. I follow all the precepts. I meditate every day." "Yes," Uttara said gently, "but you're not practicing the Dharma. You're practicing comparison." The words hit like cold water on skin. Lakuntaka wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he was genuinely trying to understand the teachings, wanted to prove he was a serious practitioner. But the truth was undeniable. Every sitting was poisoned by thoughts of how he measured against Buddha. Every teaching was filtered through the question of whether he understood it as well as Buddha would. Every interaction in the monastery was experienced through the lens of recognition received or denied. Uttara continued, "Tell me, when you're busy comparing yourself to Buddha, where is your attention?" The answer came slowly, "On him." "And when your attention is on him, where is it not?" Lakuntaka saw it clearly for the first time. "On my own mind, on the actual teachings, on what's really here." She nodded. The Buddha taught about 3 poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. Your comparison contains all 3. Greed for the recognition Buddha receives, hatred that he receives it instead of you, and delusion that your worth depends on how you measure against others. Something cracked open in Lakuntaka's chest. He realized he had spent 5 years suffering not because of Buddha's gifts, not because the monastery valued Buddha's teaching style, not because of anything external at all. The suffering was entirely self-created through the constant measuring of one mind against another. Buddha hadn't done anything to him. The senior monks hadn't rejected him. The laypeople's preference for Buddha's teaching style wasn't a judgment of Lakuntaka's worth. All of that was story, interpretation, meaning he was adding to simple facts. The fact was, Buddha had certain gifts that made people respond to him in certain ways. That's all. The suffering came from taking that fact and building an entire narrative about inadequacy, about being less than, about falling short. Uttara asked, "If you truly saw that your worth has nothing to do with comparison, how would your practice change?" That night, Lakuntaka sat in meditation differently. When the thought arose, "Buddha is better than me," he noted it simply as a thought. Empty, constructed, not true. The thought arose again, and again he noted it, without believing it, without fighting it, without building a story from it. It wasn't immediate liberation. The comparison habit was 5 years deep, carved into neural pathways, like water carving stone. But slowly, over weeks and months, the comparison lost its power. He began to notice that the Dharma was teaching him through his own direct experience, not through measuring against anyone else's understanding. He saw that having fewer teaching duties meant more time for actual practice, without the distraction of reputation management. He discovered that being overlooked created freedom, freedom to make mistakes without public scrutiny, freedom to practice without performance pressure, freedom to be exactly where he was, without needing to be anywhere else. Years later, Buddha sought out Lakuntaka privately. "Brother," he said, "I've noticed something in you that I've been seeking. People praise my words, but you have something real. A peace that doesn't depend on recognition. Will you teach me?" And Lakuntaka, without hesitation, without pride in being asked, without needing to prove anything, simply shared what he had discovered, that freedom comes not from winning the comparison, but from seeing that comparison itself is optional. You know this suffering. Maybe not in the context of monasteries and Dharma talks, but in the texture of your daily life. Your colleague gets promoted, and your immediate response isn't curiosity about their qualifications or happiness for their success. It's a gut-level calculation about what this means for you. Are you falling behind? Did they deserve it more? What does their advancement say about your trajectory? Your friend posts about their relationship, and instead of simply appreciating their joy, you're measuring their relationship against yours. They seem happier. Their partner seems more attentive. Does that mean your relationship is lacking? Someone younger than you achieves something you haven't accomplished yet, and the comparison is immediate and painful. If they can do it at 25, what does it mean that you haven't done it at 35? The Buddha understood this perfectly. He saw that comparison is a form of suffering the mind creates by measuring something fundamentally unmeasurable. You can't actually compare lives. You can only compare your internal experience of your life with your external observation of someone else's curated presentation. You're comparing your blooper reel with their highlight reel, your private struggles with their public successes, your full complexity with the simplified version they choose to display. But even knowing this intellectually doesn't stop the comparison. Lakuntaka knew for 5 years that comparison was creating suffering. The knowing didn't help because the comparison was running at a level deeper than intellectual understanding. What helped was what Uttara pointed him toward, seeing clearly that when you're busy comparing, your attention is somewhere else entirely. It's not present with your actual experience. It's not available for genuine investigation of your mind. It's trapped in an endless loop of measuring, finding inadequacy or superiority, then measuring again to confirm or deny the previous measurement. And here's what makes comparison particularly insidious. It feels productive. It feels like you're gaining useful information about where you stand, what you need to improve, how to adjust your path. But all you're actually doing is generating suffering while calling it assessment. Lakuntaka spent 5 years thinking his comparison was helping him become a better practitioner. In reality, it was preventing any actual practice from happening. His attention was so consumed by measuring himself against Buddha that he never actually investigated his own mind with the clarity needed for genuine understanding. Think about how much energy you spend on comparison in a single day. Scrolling through social media, measuring your life against curated snapshots, walking into work, calculating how your achievements stack up against colleagues, talking with friends, silently comparing your problems to theirs to determine whose life is harder. All that energy could flow into actually living your life, into experiencing what's here without the constant measuring, into developing your genuine capacities instead of tracking how they compare to others' capacities. What would one day feel like without comparison? Not trying to be better than others, not consoling yourself that you're not worse, just experiencing your own life on its own terms without the measuring stick. This isn't about lowering standards or abandoning growth. Lakuntaka didn't stop developing his understanding when he stopped comparing. He finally started developing it authentically because his attention was available for actual practice instead of constant measuring. And it isn't about pretending everyone is equal in all abilities. Buddha clearly had gifts for teaching that Lakuntaka didn't have. That's fact, not comparison. Comparison is the suffering added to the fact, the meaning you extract, the conclusions you draw about worth and inadequacy. When Lakuntaka finally saw comparison clearly as just a mental habit rather than truth, Buddha's gifts stopped diminishing him. They were simply Buddha's path, irrelevant to Lakuntaka's path, interesting to observe, but not requiring any response from Lakuntaka's sense of worth. Right now, notice if comparison is running in the background of your mind. Maybe you're comparing how well you're following these teachings to how well others would follow them. Maybe you're measuring whether you're relaxing as deeply as you should be. Maybe you're calculating whether this practice session is better or worse than previous ones. Even here, even now, the comparison mechanism keeps running unless you see it clearly and choose differently. The peace Lakuntaka found didn't come from finally being recognized by the monastery. It didn't come from becoming as skilled a teacher as Buddha. It came from recognizing that the entire game of comparison was optional, a habit he could drop, a weight he could set down. You are not in competition with anyone because there is no race, no ranking, no final score that determines human worth. There is just this life, unfolding exactly as it is, incomparable to any other life, because comparison requires a common scale, and lives don't fit on scales. Buddha discovered late in his practice what Lakuntaka had learned through suffering, that the recognition, praise, and elevated status he received were completely empty of the meaning he'd unconsciously assigned them. They didn't make him more worthy, didn't bring lasting satisfaction, didn't resolve the fundamental questions of existence. What brought peace to both of them was the same thing: stopping the comparison entirely. Not through effort or force, but through seeing clearly that comparison was adding suffering to simple reality. Let yourself feel what it would be like to simply exist without measuring, without calculating where you stand, without tracking who's ahead or behind, without converting every observation into data about your relative worth. Just being here, breathing, experiencing, without the constant, exhausting work of figuring out how you measure up. The comparison you've been doing isn't helping you grow or protecting you from failure or keeping you humble. It's a cage made of thoughts, and you've been treating those thoughts as bars too solid to walk through. They're not solid. They're just thoughts, arising and passing like everything else. And you can notice them, acknowledge them, and let them pass without building your life around them. This is where freedom lives, not in being better than others or even equal to others, but in recognizing that the entire framework of comparison is something your mind constructed and your mind can release. The third prison is built from ideas you never chose but defend as if your life depends on them. You have political opinions you inherited from your parents, without ever examining whether they align with your actual values or observations. You hold beliefs about success that came from movies and advertisements, not from investigating what actually brings you satisfaction. You carry assumptions about relationships that you absorbed from the culture around you, never questioning whether they're true or helpful. And yet when someone challenges these borrowed thoughts, you react as if they're attacking your identity. Your body tenses, your mind races to find counter-arguments, your throat tightens with the urgency to defend something you didn't even consciously choose to believe. This happens because over time, the opinions you've carried become inseparable from how you understand yourself. You're not just someone who holds conservative views or progressive views. You are a conservative or a progressive, and questioning the views feels like questioning your existence. You're not just someone who values financial success. You are someone whose worth is measured by achievement, and doubting that belief feels like losing solid ground. The Buddha saw this pattern everywhere he traveled. People clinging desperately to beliefs they'd inherited from family, culture, religion, teachers, beliefs they'd never actually investigated but would fight to protect. And he saw how this clinging created immense suffering, not because the beliefs were necessarily wrong, but because holding them without examination turned them into prisons. In the Kalama Sutta, he addressed this directly with people who were drowning in exactly this confusion. The village of Kesaputta sat along a major trade route where spiritual teachers regularly passed through, each claiming to possess absolute truth. For years, the Kalamas, the people of this village, had been exposed to an endless parade of contradictory teachings. One teacher would arrive and declare with complete certainty that everything was determined by fate, that human choice was an illusion, that your current suffering or happiness was the inevitable result of past lives beyond your control. He would present elaborate philosophical arguments, quote ancient texts, and leave the villagers convinced they should accept their circumstances without trying to change them. Weeks later, another teacher would appear and proclaim with equal certainty that fate was nonsense, that humans had complete free will, that every outcome was entirely the result of current choices and effort. He would offer different philosophical arguments, quote different texts, and persuade the villagers that their previous beliefs were foolish. Then came teachers, insisting that elaborate rituals and prayers could guarantee happiness. Others declaring that rituals were meaningless superstition. Some taught that the world was essentially good, others that it was fundamentally corrupt. Some said desire should be indulged, others that it should be ruthlessly suppressed. Each teacher spoke with absolute conviction, dismissed all competing views as ignorant or deluded, and demanded that followers accept their teaching as ultimate truth. And the Kalamas, wanting to believe in something, trying to find solid ground, kept adopting each new teaching, only to abandon it when the next convincing teacher arrived. The suffering was predictable. They would commit to a belief system, organize their lives around it, defend it against neighbors who believed differently, feel guilty when they couldn't maintain faith in it. Then when doubt crept in, or a new teacher presented compelling arguments, they would feel the shame of having been foolish enough to believe the previous teaching. Worse, they began fighting among themselves. Families divided over which teacher to follow. Friends became enemies because one believed in fate, while the other believed in free will. The village fractured into factions, each defending their chosen belief system against all others, each certain they possessed truth, while their neighbors wallowed in delusion. When the Buddha arrived, the Kalamas approached him with desperation. "Venerable Sir," their spokesperson said, "many teachers come through our village, each claiming absolute truth, each contradicting all the others. We don't know what to believe anymore. How do we know which teaching is correct? How do we know who to follow?" They expected the Buddha to do what every other teacher had done, proclaim his teaching superior, provide reasons why his view was right and all others wrong, demand faith in his authority. Instead, the Buddha said something that shocked them into silence. "It is proper for you to doubt, to be uncertain. Uncertainty has arisen in you about what is doubtful." He wasn't praising doubt as a virtue or telling them to remain forever confused. He was acknowledging that their doubt was the appropriate response to contradictory claims presented with no way to verify them. Their confusion wasn't a failure. It was intelligence recognizing that something was wrong with the entire approach they'd been taking. Then, he did something revolutionary. He systematically dismantled every authority they'd been using to determine what to believe. Do not believe something simply because you've heard it repeated many times, he said. Repetition doesn't make something true. The Kalamas shifted uncomfortably. They had believed many things, simply because everyone around them repeated them constantly, that certain groups were inferior, that certain practices brought good fortune, that certain ways of living were naturally right. Do not believe something because it's written in sacred texts or ancient scriptures, the Buddha continued. Age doesn't guarantee truth. More discomfort. They had accepted numerous beliefs purely because old books proclaimed them, assuming that ancient wisdom must be correct. Do not believe something because it seems logical and reasonable, he said. Logic can be used to justify almost anything, and what seems reasonable often depends on unexamined assumptions. Do not believe something because it agrees with your current views, the Buddha said. Your desire for confirmation doesn't make something true. Do not believe something because the speaker appears credible, charismatic, or confident. Confidence is not the same as truth. Do not believe something simply because your teacher says it's true, even if that teacher is me. The silence that followed was profound. The Kalamas had spent years trying to figure out which authority to trust, which teacher to follow, which belief system to adopt. And here was the Buddha saying, "Don't follow any authority, including mine." One of the villagers found courage to ask the obvious question, then what should we believe? If we can't trust teachers or texts or tradition or logic, what's left? The Buddha's answer was simple, but demanded something most people found more difficult than blind faith: direct investigation. Examine your own experience, he said. When you act from greed, what happens? Not what should happen according to some teaching, but what actually happens in your direct experience. Does it lead to your welfare and happiness, or to harm and suffering? A woman in the crowd spoke up hesitantly. When I act from greed, there's initial pleasure, but then anxiety follows. Fear of losing what I've gained. Resentment toward those who have more. The pleasure is brief, but the suffering lasts. Yes, the Buddha said, gently. Not because I told you so, not because some text proclaims it, but because you've seen it directly in your own life. Another villager, when I act from hatred, even when I feel completely justified in my anger, I notice my body becomes tense. My mind spins with resentment. I can't sleep. The hatred hurts me more than it hurts the person I'm angry at. You've discovered this through your own investigation, the Buddha confirmed. This truth is yours because you've verified it yourself, not because you borrowed it from a teacher. Over the following days, the Buddha guided them in examining their own minds with the precision they'd previously devoted to defending borrowed beliefs. Not accepting his word, but testing teachings against direct experience. One elder woman realized she'd been following elaborate purification rituals for decades, purely from fear, without ever examining whether they actually brought the peace they promised. When she investigated honestly, she saw they brought only temporary relief, followed by renewed anxiety about performing them correctly. A young man saw that he'd adopted his father's political views without ever investigating whether they led to less suffering or more. When he looked carefully at his own experience, he noticed these views created anger, division, and a constant sense of being under threat. A merchant discovered she'd been pursuing wealth according to cultural definitions of success, without ever asking whether accumulation brought her genuine satisfaction. She saw that each achievement brought brief pleasure, followed by immediate focus on the next acquisition, leaving her perpetually unsatisfied despite increasing wealth. The transformation wasn't that they learned new beliefs to replace old ones. It was that they stopped relating to beliefs as things requiring defense and started relating to them as hypotheses requiring investigation. When someone questioned their views, they no longer felt attacked. They could say, "That's an interesting perspective. Let me examine whether it fits my actual experience." When they encountered contradictory teachings, they could investigate both without needing to immediately choose a side and defend it. The anxiety of, "Am I believing the right thing?" dissolved because they were no longer outsourcing truth to authorities. They were discovering it through patient, honest investigation of their own lives. When the Buddha left Kesaputta, he hadn't given them a new set of beliefs to cling to. He'd given them something far more valuable: permission and methodology to investigate reality themselves. You carry this same burden the Kalamas carried. Maybe not in the form of wandering spiritual teachers, but in opinions and beliefs you've never actually examined. Think about a political view you hold strongly. Have you investigated it carefully, examined evidence from multiple perspectives, honestly assessed whether it leads to less suffering or more? Or did you inherit it from your family, absorb it from your social group, adopt it because everyone around you held it, and questioning felt like betrayal? Notice how much energy you spend defending this view, how angry you feel toward people who disagree, how threatened you feel when someone presents information that contradicts what you believe. That defensive energy isn't protecting truth. It's protecting an identity you've built around a borrowed belief. Or consider beliefs about success, about what makes a good life. Do you actually know, from your own investigation, that financial achievement brings lasting satisfaction? Or have you accepted this from a culture built on consumption, never questioning whether it's true? Have you examined whether the relationship model you're following actually fits your nature and brings you peace? Or are you defending a structure you absorbed without investigation, feeling guilty when it doesn't work, assuming the problem is your failure rather than the structure itself? The Buddha's invitation to the kalamas is the same invitation available to you. Stop defending and start investigating. This doesn't mean abandoning all beliefs or becoming paralyzed by relativism. The kalamas didn't end up believing nothing. They ended up believing what they'd personally verified through careful investigation. But those verified understandings sat lightly, held as working hypotheses rather than absolute truths requiring defense. What makes this terrifying for most people is that opinions are a huge part of how you identify yourself. I'm someone who believes in justice, gives you a team, a sense of purpose, enemies to oppose, allies to support. Letting go of unexamined political beliefs can feel like losing your place in the world, losing your community, losing your sense of being on the right side. The kalamas felt this same terror when the Buddha dismantled their authorities. If they couldn't trust teachers, texts, tradition, or logic, what would guide them? The groundlessness felt unbearable until they discovered that direct investigation provided something more solid than borrowed certainty ever had. What they found, what you can find, is that beliefs verified through personal investigation don't require the exhausting defense that borrowed beliefs demand. When you know something from your own careful observation, someone disagreeing doesn't threaten you. You can hear their perspective with genuine curiosity because your understanding isn't dependent on everyone agreeing with you. The merchant who discovered through investigation that wealth beyond basic security brought diminishing returns didn't need to convince anyone else of this. She simply lived accordingly, and when people questioned her choices, she could say, "This is what I've found in my experience. Your experience might be different." No defensiveness, no need to prove her choice superior, just calm acknowledgement of what she'd discovered. Right now, notice if there are beliefs you're defending in your mind, even as you listen to these teachings. Maybe you're thinking, "But my political views are right. The other side really is wrong." Maybe you're thinking, "Success really does require financial achievement. That's just reality." That defensive quality is the signal. Beliefs you've actually investigated don't need that kind of defense. They sit in your understanding the way knowing fire is hot sits, not as an identity requiring protection, but as verified understanding that informs your choices. The Buddha told the kalamas something crucial. When you know for yourselves that these things are skillful, blameless, praised by the wise, and when undertaken and observed lead to welfare and happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. Notice the criteria isn't whether the belief makes you feel superior, whether it matches your group's views, whether it's logically consistent. The criteria is, does it actually lead to less suffering when you live by it? This is radically practical investigation, not philosophical speculation. You don't need to figure out the ultimate nature of reality or resolve ancient philosophical debates. You just need to look honestly at what happens when you live, from greed versus generosity, hatred versus compassion, delusion versus clarity. But honest investigation requires something most people find difficult: willingness to be wrong. The Kalamas had to face that they'd been wrong repeatedly. Wrong to trust this teacher, wrong to believe that text, wrong to follow that tradition. Their egos wanted to defend past choices, to insist they'd been right all along, to blame the teachers rather than admit they'd been too quick to believe without investigating. You face this same challenge. Admitting you've been defending beliefs you never examined means acknowledging you've been living partly on autopilot, adopting views because they were convenient or comfortable rather than because they were true. This admission doesn't mean you were stupid or weak. It means you were human, doing what humans naturally do, accepting the beliefs of your environment as a shortcut to understanding a complex world. But now you have a choice the Kalamas discovered. You can continue defending borrowed beliefs, or you can start the patient work of investigation. What would it feel like to hold your strongest political opinion as a hypothesis rather than a fact? To say, "This is what I currently understand based on my investigation, and I'm open to new information that might change that understanding." Not wishy-washy or uncommitted, but genuinely investigative rather than defensively certain. The freedom isn't in finding perfect beliefs to replace imperfect ones. The freedom is in the investigative stance itself, holding all beliefs lightly enough to examine them honestly, defending nothing because you're too interested in truth to waste energy, protecting ideas that might not be true. The Kalamas found that this stance didn't create the chaos they'd feared. It created clarity, because they were no longer confused by contradictory authorities all claiming certainty. It created peace, because they were no longer anxiously defending positions they didn't actually understand. It created community, because they could disagree with neighbors without needing to convince them or be convinced. Let yourself feel the weight of defending beliefs you've never examined. The mental energy it takes to maintain political positions against all challenges, the anxiety about being on the right side, the anger toward people who believe differently, the guilt when your own experience contradicts what you're supposed to believe. All of that weight can drop away. Not through adopting new beliefs or finding better authorities to follow, but through the simple practice of honest investigation the Buddha taught 25 centuries ago, and that remains just as revolutionary today. You don't need permission from anyone to examine your own beliefs. You don't need credentials or special knowledge. You just need willingness to look honestly at what happens when you live from this belief versus that one. The investigation itself is the freedom, not the conclusions you reach, but the investigative relationship to belief that replaces defensive clinging with curious examination. And in that freedom, you discover something the Kalamas discovered, that truth verified through personal investigation sits so lightly it needs no defense, brings such clarity it needs no anxiety, provides such solid ground it needs no borrowed certainty to prop it up. The fourth prison is the deepest, the one that contains all the others, the belief that there's a permanent you that needs defending, improving, and protecting. This isn't about denying your existence. You're clearly here, breathing, experiencing, reading these words. But what you think of as I, this solid, unchanging entity that persists from birth to death, is actually something quite different from what you've been assuming. You look at a river and don't think this permanent, unchanging object called river. You see flowing water, constantly changing, never the same from one moment to the next. But you look at yourself and think, this permanent, unchanging me, even though your body, thoughts, feelings, and circumstances change constantly, just like the river. This misunderstanding creates enormous suffering because you spend your entire life trying to protect, improve, and defend something that isn't actually there in the way you think it is. The Buddha taught this as his core insight, the understanding that freed him completely. He saw that what we call self is actually a collection of constantly changing processes, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, consciousness, that work together but have no permanent, independent essence binding them. When you believe in a permanent self, every threat to that imagined entity feels like a threat to your existence. Someone criticizes your work, and it feels like you yourself are being attacked, not just your actions. You make a mistake, and it feels like you are a mistake, not just someone who made one. You fail at something, and your entire worth seems to collapse because you've identified yourself with your achievements. All of this suffering comes from misunderstanding what you actually are. 23 centuries ago, a king named Milinda ruled over a prosperous kingdom in what is now Afghanistan. He was famous throughout the land, not just for his political skill, but for his sharp intellect and his ability to defeat any philosopher or religious teacher in debate. Milinda had studied Greek philosophy under the best teachers, mastered logic and rhetoric, and built his entire identity around being the wisest king, the one who could see through any argument and expose any flaw in reasoning. His sense of self was completely wrapped up in this intellectual superiority. When he heard about a Buddhist monk named Nagasena who taught that there was no permanent self, Milinda felt both intrigued and threatened. If this teaching was true, it would undermine everything he understood about existence. If it was false, he would easily expose it and add another victory to his reputation. He summoned Nagasena to the palace for a public debate. The monk arrived on a day when the palace was filled with nobles, scholars, and officials, all eager to watch their brilliant king dismantle this peculiar Buddhist teaching. Milinda sat on his throne, surrounded by the symbols of his power and identity, the crown, the royal robes, the courtiers, acknowledging his superiority. He began immediately, confident in his approach. "Venerable sir, is there a permanent self?" "Your Majesty," Nagasena replied calmly, "the Buddha taught that all phenomena including what we call self, are impermanent processes, not permanent essences. Melinda smiled, thinking he'd found an easy victory. Then tell me, monk, what is your name? I am called Nagasena. Aha, the king said triumphantly. So there is a Nagasena. You've contradicted yourself immediately. You claim there's no self, yet you identify yourself with a name. The courtiers murmured approvingly, impressed by the king's quick trap. But Nagasena remained perfectly calm, unbothered by what seemed like a devastating logical point. Your Majesty, he said, you arrived here in a chariot, did you not? Yes. Is the pole the chariot? Melinda frowned slightly, unsure where this was going. No. Are the wheels the chariot? No. The axle? No. The seat? No. The reins? No. Nagasena went through every component of the chariot. The frame, the yoke, the banner staff, every single part, and each time the king acknowledged that the individual part was not the chariot. Then, Your Majesty, Nagasena said gently, what is this chariot you speak of? You say it exists, yet you acknowledge that none of its parts are the chariot. Are you lying when you say you arrived in a chariot? The king felt his certainty waver for the first time in the debate. The courtiers leaned forward, suddenly less certain of their king's inevitable victory. The chariot, Melinda said slowly, is all these parts working together. The pole, wheels, axle, seat, all assembled and functioning as a unit. Chariot is the conventional designation for this collection of parts. Exactly, Your Majesty, Nagasena said, his voice warm with appreciation. Chariot is a convenient label we apply to a collection of parts functioning together. There is no permanent essence called chariot apart from these changing components. Remove the wheels, and it's no longer a chariot. Replace the axle, and the components have changed, but we still call it a chariot. The chariot isn't a thing. It's a process, a collection, a conventional designation. The king nodded, following the logic perfectly. And similarly, Nagasena continued, Nagasena is a conventional designation for this collection of changing physical and mental processes. There's a body, constantly replacing cells, never the same, from one moment to the next. There are thoughts, arising and passing away like waves on water. There are feelings, changing with circumstances. There's consciousness, coming and going with each sense contact. All functioning together, but no permanent Nagasena essence apart from these processes. Melinda's mind raced. He looked at his own hand, opening and closing it. Was this the same hand from his childhood? Every cell had been replaced multiple times. Was it even the same hand from this morning? Thousands of cells had died and been replaced in just these few hours. But I remember my childhood, he protested, feeling his grip on certainty slipping. Surely that proves there's a continuous me? Your Majesty, is the child, you still here? Melinda paused, really considering the question for the first time in his life. His childhood body was completely gone, every cell replaced. His childhood thoughts no longer existed, except as memories, which were themselves just current thoughts about the past. His childhood feelings were gone. Everything he'd identified as him as a child had ceased to exist. Then what? He asked quietly, his voice losing its confident edge. Is this I that seems to persist? Nagasena asked another question. When you light a lamp at dusk, and it burns until dawn, is the flame at dawn the same as the flame at dusk? Melinda thought carefully. It's neither the same flame nor a different flame. It's a continuously changing process. Each moment the flame is new, fueled by the oil and wick, but there's continuity of process. Exactly, Nagasena said. And so is what you call I, not a permanent entity, but a process of constant change. Thoughts arise dependently on conditions. Sounds reach the ear. Consciousness arises. Feelings arise dependently on conditions. The body encounters pleasure or pain. Feeling arises. Nothing exists independently, permanently, as a separate self. The king sat in silence, and in that silence, something fundamental shifted in his understanding. He had spent his entire life building, protecting, and promoting something, King Melinda, that was actually just a constantly changing collection of processes. All that effort to defend and enhance a self that had no permanent existence, that changed completely every few years, that would eventually dissolve entirely when death scattered the processes that had been temporarily functioning together. But if there's no permanent self, Melinda asked, and the question came from genuine bewilderment now, rather than debate strategy. What am I defending when I defend my honor? What am I building when I build my kingdom? What am I protecting when I protect my reputation? Exactly, Nagasena said softly. What are you defending? The question hung in the throne room like incense smoke. The courtiers waited for their king to respond, to find the flaw in the argument, to restore the certainty they'd always relied on. But Melinda didn't respond with argument. He sat looking at his hands, his robes, his throne, all the markers of the self he'd been so certain existed, and saw them for what they were, temporary arrangements of matter and meaning, constantly changing, no permanent essence to grasp. The realization wasn't cold or nihilistic. It was liberating in a way he'd never experienced, despite all his philosophical studies and intellectual victories. He realized he'd spent decades protecting something that wasn't even there as a permanent thing, like a person building an elaborate fence around empty space, posting guards to protect nothing, going to war to defend a possession that had never existed. You know this exhaustion. Maybe you've never thought of it in these exact terms, but you've felt the burden of maintaining a self that constantly needs defending, improving, proving. Someone insults you, and the pain isn't just about the words, it's about the threat to your sense of being a good person, a competent person, a person worthy of respect. But if you saw clearly that good person is just a temporary label applied to a collection of changing thoughts and actions, not a permanent essence that can be damaged, would the insult still create that same suffering? You make a mistake at work, and you don't just think, that action didn't work. You think, I am incompetent, collapsing a single event into a judgment about your permanent self. But if you saw that there's no permanent incompetent self, only a process that sometimes produces skillful actions and sometimes doesn't, would the mistake still generate that same shame? You compare yourself to someone more successful and feel diminished, as if their achievement somehow reduces your worth. But this only makes sense if you believe in a permanent self that can be measured on a scale with other permanent selves. When you see that both selves are just temporary collections of changing processes, what is there to compare? The teaching isn't asking you to deny your experience or pretend you don't exist. You're clearly experiencing thoughts, sensations, emotions right now. The teaching is pointing out that what you think of as I, this permanent, unchanging entity having these experiences, is actually just another experience arising in awareness. Right now, notice thoughts arising in your mind. They appear, exist briefly, disappear. Notice sensations in your body. They change constantly. Pressure, temperature, tingling, all in flux. Notice emotions moving through like weather, arising, intensifying, fading. All of this is happening, but where is the permanent, you supposedly having these experiences? Can you find it as a separate thing, distinct from the experiences themselves? Or is what you call I actually just the flow of experiences conventionally labeled as a self for practical purposes, but empty of any permanent, independent essence? This isn't philosophical wordplay. It's direct investigation of what's actually here when you look carefully. Melinda discovered this through the chariot analogy, but you can discover it right now through simple observation. The you that woke up this morning isn't the same as the you reading these words. Different thoughts, different physical state, different mood, different everything, except the convention of using the same name. And seeing this clearly changes everything about how you relate to experience. When you believe in a permanent self, you take everything personally because everything seems to be happening to this solid, unchanging you. Criticism hits hard because it's damaging the self. Praise feels essential because it's validating the self. Change feels threatening because it's disrupting the self's stability. But when you see that self is actually a process, not a thing, you can engage with life without the constant defensive crouch. Criticism becomes information about an action rather than an attack on your essence. Praise becomes pleasant, but not necessary for your worth. Change becomes natural movement rather than existential threat. This doesn't make you passive or indifferent. Milinda didn't stop being king after his conversation with Nagasena. He continued ruling, making decisions, taking action. But he did it without the constant burden of defending and proving a permanent self that had never existed in the first place. Think about how much energy you spend trying to maintain consistency in your self-image. You contradict yourself and feel compelled to explain why you're not being inconsistent, because inconsistency threatens the illusion of a permanent, unchanging self. You change your mind about something and feel you need to justify it, because changing means the self isn't as solid as you thought. All that energy could flow into simply responding appropriately to current circumstances, rather than maintaining an image of who you've always been. Or notice how much suffering comes from believing your emotions define yourself. You feel anxious and think, "I am an anxious person," turning a temporary experience into a permanent identity. You feel sad and think, "I am broken," collapsing a passing emotion into a judgment about your essential nature. But if you saw clearly that anxiety is just a temporary arising in awareness, like a cloud passing through empty sky, would you grasp it so tightly? If you recognize sadness as weather moving through rather than proof of permanent damage to a permanent self, would it create the same suffering? The Buddha didn't teach this to make you question whether you exist. He taught it to free you from the exhausting work of defending, maintaining, and improving something that only exists as a convenient label for a collection of changing processes. When Milinda finally understood this, the relief was immediate and profound. Not because he'd gained something new, but because he could finally stop the endless work of protecting, proving, and perfecting a self that had always been an illusion. Let yourself feel what it would be like to stop defending a permanent self. Not to become nothing or lose your identity, but to recognize that the identity you've been so carefully maintaining is already just a collection of changing experiences, conventionally labeled as you, but empty of any permanent essence. Someone criticizes you, and instead of defending yourself, you simply hear the information about an action. You make a mistake, and instead of it proving something permanent about your inadequacy, it's just an event in the flow of events. You succeed at something, and instead of it defining your worth, it's just a pleasant outcome of conditions coming together. This isn't detachment or not caring. It's the freedom to engage fully with life without the constant burden of protecting something that was never there as you imagined it. The chariot still functions even though it has no permanent essence beyond its parts working together. You still function, thinking, feeling, acting, relating, even though you have no permanent essence beyond these processes working together. The difference is, you stop suffering over the imagined need to defend and perfect an entity that exists only as a conventional designation for a flow of experience. Milinda became known as one of the wisest kings of his era, not because he learned to defend his self better, but because he saw through the illusion of a permanent self requiring defense. And in seeing through that illusion, he found a peace deeper than any intellectual victory had ever brought him. Right now, you don't need to fully understand this intellectually. You just need to look honestly at your direct experience. Can you find a permanent, unchanging you, separate from the flow of thoughts, sensations, and experiences? Or is what you call I actually just this flow itself, constantly changing like a river, empty of any solid, graspable essence? In that looking, in that honest investigation, the same freedom Milinda discovered becomes available. Not through believing this teaching, but through seeing directly what's actually here when you stop assuming and start observing. The prison of self isn't locked from the outside. It's maintained by the constant effort to defend, prove, and perfect something that has no more permanent existence than a flame or a river or a chariot, just a collection of changing processes, conventionally labeled as I. And when you see this clearly, really see it in your direct experience, rather than just understand it as a concept, the prison door doesn't need to be opened. You realize it was never actually there. The final teaching brings everything together into one essential question: how do you actually let go? You've seen how defending self-image creates suffering. You've seen how comparison traps you in endless measuring. You've seen how unexamined beliefs become prisons. You've seen how clinging to a permanent self generates constant anxiety about protecting something that isn't even there as you imagine it. But knowing these things intellectually doesn't automatically free you from them. You can understand perfectly that comparison creates suffering and still find yourself measuring your worth against others the moment you open social media. You can see clearly that borrowed beliefs imprison you and still feel defensive when someone challenges your political views. So the question becomes, how does understanding actually transform into freedom? Most people approach this the same way they approach everything else in their lives, through effort, through force, through willpower. They try to let go the way they'd try to lift a weight or run a marathon, through gritting their teeth and pushing harder. I shouldn't care what people think. You tell yourself firmly, trying to force yourself into not caring. I need to stop comparing myself to others, you command, attempting to willpower your way out of comparison. I must release my attachments, you insist, using all your strength to push away the very things you're clinging to. But this approach has a fundamental problem. The trying itself is more ego activity. The ego trying to fix the ego, the self trying to eliminate the self, attachment, using force to overcome attachment. It's like trying to make yourself fall asleep by commanding yourself to sleep harder. The effort itself prevents the very thing you're trying to achieve. The Buddha taught something more subtle, more patient, more in alignment with how transformation actually happens. He taught that genuine letting go isn't forced. It emerges naturally when the right conditions are present. This understanding came into sharp focus through his encounter with a young monk who made exactly this mistake. Meghiya served as the Buddha's personal attendant during a period when the Sangha was traveling through the countryside. He stayed close to the Buddha throughout each day, ready to fulfill any need, manage any request, handle any practical matter that arose. It was demanding work that required constant attention, and Meghiya found himself longing for time alone to practice meditation without the endless interruptions of service. He wanted to achieve liberation, to experience the peace the Buddha spoke about, to finally break through the obstacles that seemed to plague his mind. One afternoon, as they walked along a forest path, they passed the most beautiful mango grove Meghiya had ever seen. The trees were perfectly arranged, their branches creating natural shade, the ground beneath them soft and inviting. A small stream ran nearby, its sound exactly the kind of peaceful background that seemed perfect for deep meditation. Meghiya felt a powerful certainty arise in his mind. This was it. This was the perfect place where he would finally achieve enlightenment. If he could just spend one day meditating in such ideal conditions, all his spiritual struggles would end. The setting was so conducive to peace that liberation seemed inevitable. He approached the Buddha with urgency. "Venerable Sir, I've found an ideal spot for meditation practice. Please allow me to spend the day there practicing." The Buddha looked at him with gentle concern. "I'm alone right now with no other attendant, Meghiya. Please wait until another monk arrives to take your place." But Meghiya was seized with the conviction that this opportunity couldn't be missed. Perfect conditions for enlightenment didn't appear every day, and if he let this chance pass, who knew when another would come? The Buddha had already achieved liberation. Surely he could manage alone for one day, while Meghiya grasped this crucial opportunity. He asked again, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. The Buddha recognized immediately. And again. Finally, the Buddha said quietly, "How can I prevent someone who speaks of liberation from going? Do as you see fit, Meghiya." Meghiya rushed to the mango grove, his heart racing with anticipation. He found the most beautiful tree, settled beneath it in perfect posture, closed his eyes, and waited for the peace that would surely come in such ideal surroundings. Instead, his mind exploded. Thoughts of sensuality flooded him like a dam breaking. Memories of pleasures he'd renounced when he became a monk rushed back with startling intensity. Fantasies about foods he'd given up, comforts he'd left behind, experiences he was missing, all of it crashed through his consciousness with overwhelming force. He tried to push the thoughts away, to force his mind back to meditation, but the effort only seemed to strengthen them. The more he tried not to think about sensual pleasures, the more vividly they appeared in his mind. Then came anger, resentment toward the Buddha for making him wait when he'd asked to practice, for not understanding the urgency of his spiritual need, irritation at himself for being unable to control his mind despite all his training, hostility toward the entire path for being so much more difficult than it had seemed when he first joined the monastery. He tried to suppress the anger, to replace it with loving kindness, but the suppression only drove it deeper, where it churned and festered, erupting again with greater force. Then came doubt. Maybe enlightenment wasn't actually possible. Maybe the Buddha's teachings were exaggerated, or only worked for exceptional people. Maybe he'd made a mistake becoming a monk. Maybe he should return to household life before wasting more years on an impossible goal. Hour after hour, Meghiya sat beneath that perfect tree in that perfect grove, tortured by his own mind. The beautiful setting that had seemed to promise liberation had become the backdrop for his worst meditation session ever. As evening approached, he returned to the Buddha, defeated and humiliated. He'd been so certain that the right place would bring instant peace, so confident that perfect conditions would force a breakthrough. Instead, he'd discovered that his mind in a beautiful grove was exactly as chaotic as his mind anywhere else, maybe more so, because the gap between his expectations and reality created additional suffering. "Venerable Sir," he admitted, his voice small with shame, "I thought the perfect place would bring peace, but my mind was worse than ever." The Buddha's response contained no judgment, no "I told you so," just patient teaching that addressed exactly what Meghiya needed to understand. 5 things lead to the maturing of mind, the Buddha said. First, good friendship with those who embody the qualities you're trying to develop. Second, virtue, not perfection, but sincere commitment to not causing harm. Third, conversation that uplifts and clarifies rather than distracts and confuses. Fourth, energy that is balanced between effort and ease, neither forcing nor giving up. Fifth, wisdom that sees things as they actually are rather than as you wish them to be. Meghiya listened, feeling the gap between what he'd been doing and what the Buddha was describing. "But I had a beautiful place," he protested, still clinging to the belief that external conditions should have been enough. The Buddha's voice was infinitely patient. A beautiful place without these 5 foundations is like planting seeds in concrete. The environment may be perfect, but growth requires proper conditions, not just pleasant surroundings. Over the following months, the teaching slowly penetrated Meghiya's understanding. He began to see how he'd been approaching practice like a task to be conquered through force and perfect conditions, rather than a garden to be tended with patience and proper care. He noticed how isolation from good friends had left him without support when difficult thoughts arose, how his virtue had gaps, small deceptions, and shortcuts that undermined his foundation, how his conversations often reinforced confusion rather than clarity, how his energy swung between forcing and collapsing, never finding the sustainable middle, how his wisdom was actually just concepts he'd memorized rather than insights he'd personally verified. None of these conditions could be forced into place through willpower. They had to be cultivated gradually, the way a farmer prepares soil, plants, seeds, provides water, and then waits patiently for growth to emerge in its own time. Meghiya stopped trying to force enlightenment and started creating conditions for understanding to naturally arise. He cultivated genuine friendships with monks whose peace wasn't performance, but actual embodiment of the teachings. He examined his virtue honestly, closing the gaps where he'd been cutting corners. He chose conversations that challenged his assumptions and clarified his confusion rather than ones that simply confirmed what he already believed. He found a pace of practice he could sustain, energetic but not desperate, relaxed but not lazy. And most importantly, he stopped taking his thoughts about the path as facts and started investigating his actual experience. When doubt arose, instead of believing it or fighting it, he examined it. What is doubt? How does it feel in the body? What conditions brought it? What happens when I simply observe it without grasping or pushing away? The transformation didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic moment in a perfect grove where everything suddenly clicked. Instead, gradually, like dawn light, slowly illuminating a landscape, understanding began to emerge from the conditions he'd been patiently cultivating. Years later, long after he'd stopped trying to force liberation, it arose naturally, like a fruit that falls from a tree when it's ripe, not because someone commanded it to fall, but because all the conditions for falling had quietly come together. You're making the same mistake Meghiya made if you're trying to force yourself to let go. I need to stop caring what people think. You tell yourself, and then you try to force yourself into not caring through sheer determination. But the forcing itself is caring intensely about being the kind of person who doesn't care what people think. You've just added another layer of ego activity on top of the existing pattern. I must release my jealousy, you insist, and then you use all your strength to suppress jealous feelings when they arise. But suppression isn't release. It's just pushing something down where it churns unseen, gathering strength until it erupts again with greater force. The Buddha's teaching to Meghiya applies directly to you. Letting go isn't forced. It's cultivated through creating proper conditions. What are those conditions? First, surround yourself with people who embody the peace you're seeking, not people who perform peace, or talk about peace, but people who actually live from it. Their presence creates an environment where letting go becomes natural rather than forced. You can't force yourself to be less anxious through willpower, but spending time with someone genuinely at ease allows ease to gradually infect you through proximity. Second, live with basic integrity. Not perfection, not sainthood, just sincere commitment to not deliberately causing harm. When you're lying, stealing, manipulating, or betraying trust, your mind stays agitated because part of you knows you're acting against your own deeper values. That agitation makes letting go impossible. You're generating new suffering faster than you can release old patterns. Third, choose conversations and content that clarify rather than confuse. If you spend your time consuming media that inflames anxiety, watching shows that reinforce comparison, reading content that strengthens borrowed beliefs, you're creating conditions for grasping rather than letting go. Not because these things are evil, but because conditions matter and you're cultivating the opposite of what you seek. Fourth, find sustainable effort. Meghiya learned this the hard way. Forcing doesn't work, and neither does collapsing into passivity. The middle is an energy you can maintain not just for a day or a week, but for a lifetime, engaged with practice, but not desperate, relaxed, but not lazy, showing up consistently without the peaks of intense effort followed by valleys of exhaustion and giving up. Fifth, investigate your direct experience, rather than believing borrowed ideas about what should be happening. When you're trying to let go of comparison, don't believe thoughts that say, "I should be over this by now," or "Real practitioners don't struggle like I do." Look directly. What is comparison? How does it feel? What triggers it? What happens when you observe it without grasping or pushing away? These conditions don't force letting go. They create an environment where letting go can happen naturally, the way preparing soil and providing water creates conditions for seeds to sprout, but doesn't force the sprouting. Think about trying to fall asleep. You can't force sleep through willpower. The trying itself keeps you awake. But you can create conditions for sleep: a dark room, comfortable temperature, regular schedule, quiet environment, relaxed body. With proper conditions in place, sleep comes on its own, not because you commanded it, but because you stopped preventing it. Letting go works the same way. You can't force it, but you can stop preventing it by creating conditions where release becomes natural. Right now, notice if you're trying to force yourself to let go of something. Maybe you're gripping these teachings, trying to use them to fix yourself, treating Buddhism like a self-improvement project where you force yourself into being a better, more enlightened version of you. That forcing is the problem, not the solution. Can you create conditions instead? Can you spend time with people who embody ease rather than performance? Can you live with basic integrity so your mind isn't constantly agitated by internal conflict? Can you choose content that clarifies rather than inflames? Can you find a sustainable pace of practice rather than alternating between intense effort and collapse? Can you investigate your actual experience rather than believing thoughts about what should be happening? These aren't dramatic actions. They won't create instant transformation. Meghiya didn't experience sudden enlightenment after the Buddha's teaching. He experienced years of gradual cultivation that eventually allowed understanding to naturally emerge. But gradual cultivation that actually works is infinitely more valuable than dramatic effort that keeps you trapped in the same patterns while pretending to pursue freedom. The comparison you've been trying to force yourself to stop, it will naturally release when you create conditions, when you spend time with people who don't compare, when you stop consuming media that inflames comparison, when you investigate directly what comparison actually is, rather than believing thoughts that say you shouldn't be doing it. The borrowed beliefs you've been trying to willpower your way out of, they'll naturally loosen when you create conditions, when you honestly examine whether they lead to less suffering or more, when you have conversations that allow questioning rather than defending, when you surround yourself with people who hold views lightly rather than defensively. The self-image you've been trying to force yourself to stop defending, it will naturally relax when you create conditions, when you're around people who don't need to perform, when you live with enough integrity that you don't need elaborate defenses, when you investigate directly and see that there's no permanent self requiring protection anyway. This is the freedom the Buddha taught, not freedom achieved through force, but freedom that emerges when you stop preventing it through creating conditions that naturally allow release. Meghiya spent one afternoon trying to force enlightenment in a perfect grove and achieved only greater suffering. He spent years patiently creating conditions and found that liberation emerged naturally when he finally stopped trying to make it happen. The same path is available to you, not through dramatic effort or perfect willpower, but through patient cultivation of conditions that allow the letting go you've been desperately trying to force. Let yourself rest in this understanding. You don't need to fix yourself tonight, don't need to force any transformation, don't need to achieve any particular state. You just need to begin creating conditions, small, sustainable, honest conditions, and trust that transformation works the way all natural processes work, not through force, but through patient cultivation that allows emergence in its own time. The seed doesn't need to force itself to grow. It needs proper conditions: soil, water, light, time, and then growth happens naturally, inevitably, without the seed needing to understand how, or when, or through what mechanism. You are the same. Create conditions, stop forcing, and trust the process that has freed countless beings across 25 centuries, not through dramatic willpower, but through patient, honest cultivation of what naturally allows release. You began this journey carrying the weight of defending yourself, maintaining an image, measuring against others, protecting borrowed beliefs, clinging to an imagined, permanent self. Through these teachings, you've seen how each burden was unnecessary. Chitta found peace, not by defending wisdom, but by admitting he didn't know. Lakuntaka discovered freedom not by winning comparisons, but by dropping them entirely. The Kalamas stopped suffering when they investigated directly, rather than defending inherited beliefs. Melinda saw that the self he'd been protecting his whole life was just a collection of changing processes, empty of the permanent essence he'd imagined. And Megia learned that liberation isn't forced through willpower, but emerges naturally when you create proper conditions and stop preventing it. What remains when all this defending stops? Not emptiness or meaninglessness, but the peace that was always here beneath the constant effort to prove, protect, and perfect. As you drift into sleep tonight, you don't need to achieve anything or become anyone. You don't need to remember all these teachings or get anything right. The wisdom works whether you're conscious of it or not, planting seeds that grow in their own time. Just be here, breathing, experiencing, resting in the simple fact of being without any story about who you should be or what you should achieve. This is what the Buddha pointed to across 25 centuries. The freedom that comes not from building a better self, but from seeing through the illusion that you ever needed building in the first place.